Welcome to Exhausting Stories, where history drifts softly through the shadows of time. Tonight, we invite you to explore a story both sacred and unsettling, one where the world's most powerful religious institution signed a treaty with one of history's most dangerous regimes, knowing full well the darkness it was embracing. In the can, Nazi Germany signed the Reichskonkordat, a pact that granted Hitler legitimacy on the world stage, and in return quieted Catholic opposition across Germany. But silence has a cost. Years later, newly unsealed Vatican archives revealed something chilling. A letter sent directly to the Pope's secretary, reporting that 6,000 souls were being executed each day at Belzec death camp. The Church was not in the dark. It knew. Tonight, as you lie back and let your thoughts slow, we'll gently unravel this story. Not in outrage, but in reflection. A survival strategy, or was it a moral failure too great to forget? Close your eyes and let's step softly into the past, wrapped up by the warmth of the fire. Let the story begin. In 1933, as Germany underwent a rapid transformation under Hitler's newly formed regime, the Vatican stepped into the political storm with a decision that would shape its legacy for generations. On July 20th, the Holy See signed the Reichskonkordat, Concordat, with Nazi Germany. At face value, the treaty appeared straightforward. Article 1 guaranteed Catholics the freedom to practice their faith and promised the Church autonomy within Germany. But beneath these assurances, the agreement marked a profound turning point. By signing the Concordat, the Vatican became one of the first international bodies to formally recognize Hitler's government, at a time when much of the world still viewed it with caution, if not alarm. The urgency behind the Vatican's move was real. Hitler had just been appointed Chancellor and was swiftly dismantling Germany's democratic foundations. The Catholic Church, rooted in German society through millions of followers and politically active organizations like the Centre Party, suddenly found itself exposed. Anti-Jewish measures were already underway: public boycotts, professional bans, and growing violence. In April, philosopher and convert Edith Stein, a German Catholic of Jewish descent, wrote directly to the Pope. Her letter warned that the Church's silence in the face of persecution would be interpreted as complicity. She described the new reality for Jews, shut out of public life, stripped of dignity, and forced to live in fear. To the Vatican, the stakes could not have been higher. Church leaders believed that the Concordat might shield Catholics from the rising tide of Nazi brutality. The treaty promised protection, on paper, for Catholic institutions, schools, and worship. But the price for this protection was steep. In exchange, the Vatican agreed to abstain from all political activity in Germany. This meant dissolving the very Catholic parties and organizations that had long stood as bulwarks against authoritarianism. The consequences came swiftly. Within days, the Catholic Centre Party, once a dominant voice in the Reichstag, voted to disband. Its absence removed one of the last barriers to Hitler achieving the two-thirds majority needed to rewrite the constitution and secure total control. Catholic youth groups, trade unions and associations were dismantled. As the regime expanded its power, Catholic publications were censored and priests were warned to avoid politics from the pulpit. The Church's once vocal presence in German public life grew quiet, then nearly silent. On the international stage, the Reichskonkordat was a stunning public relations victory for Hitler. While world leaders remained wary of the Nazi regime, a treaty with the Vatican, the moral and spiritual center for millions, offered legitimacy. It portrayed Hitler's government as stable, negotiable, and even respectable. For the Vatican, this global perception was an unintended outcome, but one that would stain its reputation for decades. The Church's retreat from political life had devastating implications. As Nazi oppression deepened, Catholic leaders who might have spoken out were now bound by diplomacy and caution. Edith Stein's letter would echo with bitter foresight. She had pleaded for moral clarity. Instead, she met silence. That silence left not only Jews, but many Catholics feeling abandoned. Driving the Vatican's actions was a profound fear of communism. Germany in the early 1930s was in chaos. The Weimar Republic was faltering, and the spectre of a Soviet-style revolution loomed large. Pope Pius XI and his Secretary of State, Cardinal Eugenio Pacelli, viewed atheistic Marxism as a dire threat to the Church's existence. For Pacelli, who had spent over a decade as the Vatican's envoy in Germany, the danger of communism was personal and immediate. He saw Hitler's vehement anti-communism as a temporary, if unsavory, shield against the spread of Soviet influence. This anti-communist conviction shaped every stage of the Concordat negotiations. Vatican officials believed that working with Hitler might secure the Church's survival and stave off something even worse. But this strategy came at the cost of moral clarity. As Nazi policies escalated, denying Jews citizenship, outlawing dissent, and decimating civil institutions, the Church's silence became harder to justify. The Concordat, once conceived as a safeguard, had become a symbol of surrender. Its fallout was clear. Catholic institutions, once devoted to social justice, were shuttered or brought under state control. Priests and lay leaders who resisted risked prison, or worse. What once looked like prudence now resembled compliance. The Concordat did not restrain the Nazis. It helped clear their path. At the center of it all was Cardinal Eugenio Pacelli. His deep understanding of Germany, his obsession with communism, and his pragmatic worldview shaped the Vatican's response to Hitler. To understand why the Church made these choices and why they reverberated so painfully, one must understand Pacelli's vision. Cardinal Eugenio Pacelli spent more than a decade as the Vatican's ambassador to Germany, witnessing firsthand the slow unraveling of the Weimar Republic. Immersed in a nation veering between extremes, he developed a deep and growing obsession, the perceived threat of communism. To Pacelli, Soviet atheism was more than ideology, it was an existential menace. He had seen churches shuttered, priests imprisoned, and faith branded as subversion. If communism spread across Europe, he feared, the Catholic Church itself might not survive. This fear guided nearly every diplomatic move he made. The rise of Stalin's Soviet Union, with its militant hostility toward religion, convinced Pacelli that communism wasn't just a political challenge, it was a spiritual crisis. As Marxist ideas trickled into a fragile Germany, he interpreted each leftist demonstration and anti-religious pamphlet as a harbinger of catastrophe. In his eyes, Europe was on the brink of the same darkness he had seen consume the East. When Adolf Hitler's National Socialists seized power, Pacelli was not blind to their brutality. He distrusted the Nazis, and by 1935 was already warning the Vatican of their anti-Semitic excesses. But Hitler's ferocious opposition to communism offered Pacelli a kind of reassurance. He believed that, dangerous as they were, the Nazis might serve as a bulwark against something worse, the total collapse of religion under communist rule. This belief became the cornerstone of his diplomatic strategy. The 1933 Reichskonkordat was Pacelli's calculated effort to protect the Church under a regime he neither liked nor trusted. The treaty promised protection for Catholic worship, schools, and charitable works. In return, the Vatican agreed to withdraw from political life in Germany. For Pacelli, this was a trade-off: preserve the spiritual mission, even if it meant sacrificing political influence. But the cost was staggering. The Concordat cleared the path for the dissolution of the Centre Party, Germany's last serious obstacle to one-party rule. Pacelli's gamble prioritized institutional survival over public resistance. He believed that if Catholics could still go to Mass and send their children to Catholic schools, then the Church had preserved its core, even as Nazi control spread into every corner of society. Yet Pacelli's belief that Hitler's anti-communism could somehow be harnessed for good blinded him to the deeper threat. The Nazis were not just anti-communist, they were anti-Christian. Their ideology sought to dismantle traditional moral frameworks and replace them with loyalty to the state and its racial vision. Catholic youth organizations were banned, church publications censored, and priests punished for speaking out. Even Catholic schools, which the Concordat had promised to protect, were pressured to promote Nazi doctrine. The regime shredded its promises, but Pacelli focused on the communist threat and remained committed to the deal. As evidence of Nazi hostility mounted, Pacelli continued to view the regime as a necessary evil. His focus on stopping communism eclipsed the reality that Hitler's government was dismantling the very institutions he sought to protect. For Pacelli, diplomacy offered the illusion of control. Even as the Church lost ground, he clung to the hope that diplomatic channels could salvage influence. When Pacelli became Pope Pius XII in 1939, his worldview carried into the papacy. The world was on the brink of war, and he responded with the same tactics he had relied on in Germany: careful neutrality, restrained language, and a deep reluctance to provoke confrontation. His priorities had not shifted. Communism remained the greater enemy, and this continued to shape his response to Hitler's expanding crimes. The consequences were grave. As the Nazi genocide intensified, the Vatican's silence became more conspicuous. Pius XII's reluctance to condemn the atrocities publicly reflected the same strategic logic that had defined his time as cardinal, a belief that diplomacy and restraint would preserve the Church's ability to act. But by 1942, that silence was increasingly difficult to justify. Reports of Nazi crimes poured into the Vatican. A vast network of clergy, diplomats, and informants relayed first-hand accounts of mass executions and systemic extermination. The Church was no longer in the dark. It now faced the full reality of its earlier decisions and the moral weight of what had been left unsaid. The moment of reckoning arrived in the form of a chilling letter, one that would make clear just how much the Vatican knew and force the world to confront the question. With such knowledge in hand, why did Pius XII remain silent? In December 1942, a letter arrived at the Vatican, addressed to Father Robert Leiber, the personal secretary to Pope Pius XII. The sender was Father Lothar Kuhl, a respected German Jesuit. His message was direct and devastating. According to his sources, approximately 6,000 Jews and Poles were being murdered every day at the Belzec concentration camp in southeastern Poland. This was not rumor or speculation. Kuhl's letter, dated December 14, and later reported by Corriere della Sera, was based on first-hand accounts from reliable church-aligned informants. The details were precise, the scale unthinkable, and the implications were undeniable. The Vatican could no longer claim it didn't know. The timing of the report made it even more urgent. It followed closely on the heels of the Warsaw Ghetto's liquidation, a period defined by mass deportations, executions, and systemic terror. Around the same time, the Polish government in exile had also sent the Vatican a formal warning. More than 1 million Polish Jews had already been killed. Kuhl's letter wasn't an outlier. It was part of a growing and horrifying chorus. The genocide was no longer hidden. It was being reported from every direction, by diplomats, clergy, and international observers. By then, the Vatican had built one of the most extensive intelligence networks in wartime Europe. Jesuits, bishops, and nuns risked their lives to send reports from the front lines. Priests across occupied territories heard confessions and testimonies from survivors and witnesses. Vatican diplomats stayed in constant contact with neutral governments and underground resistance movements, These streams of information, reliable and relentless, gave the Church a clear view of the atrocities unfolding in real time. Yet among these countless messages, Father Kuhl's letter stood out. It was internal, direct, and grounded in the Church's own trusted network. For an institution devoted to truth, such unambiguous testimony should have prompted an equally unambiguous response. Instead, the Vatican remained publicly silent. That silence has since become one of the most fiercely debated aspects of Pope Pius XII's legacy. Many believe that a public condemnation from the Pope, heard across Catholic Europe, could have made a real difference. From Poland to France to Italy, and even within Germany, Catholics looked to the Vatican for moral leadership. A firm denunciation of genocide might have emboldened resistance movements, or, at the very least, made the Church's stance unmistakably clear. But despite mounting evidence, including Kuhl's irrefutable report, Pius XII said nothing publicly. Why? Defenders of the Pope argue that the risk of Nazi retaliation was real. Across Europe, Catholic institutions were already under threat. Priests who defied the regime were being arrested. Church-run schools were being shut down. Catholic organizations were in the Gestapo's crosshairs. A public statement from the Pope, they contend, could have unleashed even more brutal crackdowns, putting clergy and civilians alike in danger. By staying silent, perhaps the Vatican believed it could protect what little remained. Others see a deeper calculation at play. In 1942, the war's outcome was still uncertain. If Nazi Germany succeeded in dominating Europe, the Church's survival might depend on its ability to maintain diplomatic neutrality. A cautious silence, some argued, might preserve the Church's influence and give it room to maneuver behind the scenes. But to many historians, survivors, and moral voices, these explanations fall short. They argue that the Church's mission should have transcended politics and survival. The reports were not vague, they were vivid, detailed, and overwhelming. By choosing caution over confrontation, the Vatican risked surrendering the very moral authority it claimed to uphold. It's important to note that silence was not universal within the Church. Many priests, nuns, and bishops acted with courage, hiding Jewish families, forging documents, and defying orders. These were acts of compassion and resistance, but they were rarely supported, let alone led, by the Vatican's central authority. The official position from Rome remained careful, quiet, and reserved, even as the evidence of genocide piled higher. Father Kuhl's letter remains a pivotal document, a quiet but unshakable piece of proof. It showed that the Vatican didn't just know what was happening. It knew in detail the number of deaths, the method of execution, the location, the scale, and so the haunting question endures. With such knowledge in hand, why did the Pope stay silent? This question becomes even more urgent when we consider what else was unfolding, quietly, strategically, behind closed doors in Rome and Berlin at the very same time. In 1939, as war clouds darkened Europe, a series of secret negotiations quietly unfolded between the Vatican and Nazi Germany. Conversations so discreet, they would remain hidden from the public for decades. At the center of these covert talks was Prince Philip of Hesse, a man whose aristocratic lineage and cross-national ties made him the perfect go-between. He was Hitler's chosen envoy, but also Queen Victoria's great-grandson and the son-in-law of the King of Italy. His background granted him rare access to both the Nazi elite and the inner chambers of the Vatican. These talks began shortly after Pope Pius XII's election in early 1939, at a time when the Church faced an existential crisis. With memories of the broken promises of the 1933 Concordat still fresh, the Vatican knew its institutions were increasingly under threat. Catholic schools were being shuttered, priests arrested, and religious influence steadily eroded across Nazi-held territory. Rather than retreat, church leaders chose engagement, hoping that diplomacy might shield Catholic life in a continent teetering toward totalitarianism. In 2020, the opening of long-sealed Vatican archives revealed just how extensive these communications were. Prince Philip of Hesse traveled frequently between Berlin and Rome, delivering proposals, reassurances, and requests. The discussions remained highly secret, shared only among a few trusted officials. For the Vatican, secrecy was essential. Any suggestion of collaboration with the Nazi regime could have triggered backlash from Allied nations and Catholic populations under occupation. For Hitler, visible ties with the Church risked alienating party hardliners who despised Christianity. Inside these quiet exchanges, the Vatican made its case. Pius XII sought protection for Catholic clergy, charities, and schools in occupied Europe. He wanted the Church to retain its most basic functions: worship, education, and pastoral care, without Nazi interference. In return, the Vatican signaled it would avoid direct confrontation with the regime. No public condemnation, no sharp denunciations, and no encouragement of resistance. Just quiet coexistence, so long as the Church's spiritual work could continue. But this strategy carried immense risk. By agreeing to meet with Nazi envoys, even in secret, the Vatican granted a degree of legitimacy to Hitler's regime. It sent a message that the Church was willing to adjust to a future that might be dominated by Nazi rule. For the Nazis, the benefits were clear. If they could keep the Church diplomatically engaged and publicly silent, they could weaken internal Catholic opposition without lifting a finger. Historian David Kurtzer, who examined the newly released documents, argues that these talks dismantle the myth of Vatican neutrality. Instead of standing apart, the Church was actively engaged in behind-the-scenes diplomacy, motivated by fear that Nazi victory could reshape the very foundations of Europe. Vatican leaders believed that maintaining dialogue, however morally compromised, might protect lives and institutions. But in doing so, they blurred the line between prudence and complicity. The secrecy of the negotiations was mirrored by their ambiguity. Promises were made in private, but rarely honored in public. Catholic organizations continued to be dismantled. Priests who resisted were silenced or imprisoned. Still, the Vatican held on, convinced that continued diplomacy might buy time or concessions. Prince Philip's role reveals the fragile balancing act. As a trusted link between Hitler and the Vatican, he delivered messages and shaped terms. But his loyalty lay firmly with the Nazi cause. His mission wasn't to protect the Church, it was to secure its quiet compliance. That the Vatican relied on such a figure speaks to how isolated and desperate Church leadership had become. These secret negotiations didn't end with the fall of the Third Reich. They marked a turning point in the Vatican's diplomatic approach, setting a precedent for post-war strategies that often prioritized institutional preservation over moral clarity. The opening of the archives has forced historians and believers alike to re-examine the Church's wartime role. Far from being a detached observer, the Vatican was deeply entwined in the political struggles of its time. Its leaders were navigating a world where survival often came at the cost of silence, and where the boundaries between diplomacy and betrayal could become dangerously thin. And as the war ended and a new world emerged, that same instinct to protect the Church, no matter the cost, would appear again, in ways no one had yet imagined. After World War II, as Europe lay in ruins and survivors searched desperately for loved ones, a shadowy network began to stir beneath the surface, one not focused on justice or remembrance, but on escape. This was the Vatican's secret rat line, a clandestine pipeline that quietly shepherded Nazi war criminals out of Europe, allowing some of the most notorious perpetrators of genocide to vanish into new lives. While much of the world looked to the Church for moral clarity in the wake of atrocity, some of its officials helped high-ranking Nazis evade justice, offering them sanctuary, false identities, and a path to freedom. At the heart of this effort was Bishop Alois Hudal, an Austrian cleric stationed at Santa Maria dell'Anima, the German National Church in Rome. Hudal's sympathy for the Nazi cause was well known. In the chaos of post-war Italy, with Allied troops overseeing a fragile peace and millions displaced, he leveraged his position to shelter fugitives, forge documents, and arrange their passage abroad. His methods were systematic. Using Red Cross travel documents and Vatican-issued identity papers, Hudal provided a way out for war criminals hiding in plain sight. These papers often bore false names, but carried the weight of authority, allowing men who had overseen mass murder to walk freely onto ships bound for South America or the Middle East. One of the most infamous figures to benefit was Franz Stangl, former commandant of Treblinka, one of the Holocaust's deadliest extermination camps. Responsible for nearly 1 million deaths, Stangl arrived in Rome after the war, where Hudal secured him a passport under the name Paul Stangl. When Franz questioned the false identity, Hudal reportedly advised, "It's better to let sleeping dogs lie. They're looking for Franz Stangl." With those words and forged papers, Stangl fled to Syria and then to Brazil, where he lived until his eventual capture and trial in the 1960s. But Stangl was not alone. Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the Holocaust's logistical machinery, used the same network to escape to Argentina, where he lived under an alias until Israeli agents captured him in 1960. Joseph Mengele, the angel of death of Auschwitz, also disappeared through these Vatican-linked channels, surfacing years later in South America. These were not minor fugitives. These were the men most directly responsible for genocide, and yet they passed through a system that included church offices, forged credentials, and sympathetic clergy. Whispers of escape didn't end with Eichmann or Mengele. In the post-war chaos, darker rumors emerged. Claims that Hitler himself may have fled the Berlin bunker and vanished into the same secret network that aided his top lieutenants. Declassified reports, South American witness accounts, and the absence of confirmed remains fueled speculation of his escape to Argentina, where German enclaves offered cover. The Vatican's rationale was complex and to many morally indefensible. Some officials, like Hudal, claimed they were acting out of Christian mercy, helping displaced souls in a time of chaos. Europe was indeed overwhelmed with refugees, and the Church often positioned itself as a humanitarian lifeline. But the rat lines weren't just for the displaced. They were a calculated means of aiding fugitives who had already been identified as war criminals. Another key motivation was ideological. As the Cold War emerged, the Vatican grew increasingly alarmed by the rise of communism. To some in the church hierarchy, these Nazis, fierce anti-communists with experience in organization and control, might serve as valuable assets in the global fight against Soviet influence. The thinking went, if these men could rebuild lives in South America or the Middle East, they might help build anti-communist strongholds there. But that cold calculation came at a steep moral cost. The Church's mission, to uphold justice, protect the vulnerable, and bear witness to truth, stood in stark contrast to these decisions. For survivors of the Holocaust and families of the murdered, the use of mercy and refuge to shield perpetrators felt like betrayal. The true scope of the rat lines is still unknown, in part because the Vatican has not fully opened its archives. But what is known is troubling. Red Cross documents were sometimes issued based on church recommendations. Clergy vouched for identities they knew to be false, and senior church officials were aware that these men weren't innocent refugees. They were running from justice. Historians continue to debate the motivations and morality of the Vatican's choices. Some argue that the fog of post-war Europe made it difficult to discern guilt from innocence. Others suggest the fear of communism justified extraordinary actions, but many, including voices within the Church itself, see the rat lines as a moral failure. The evidence is clear. deliberate protection was extended to men who orchestrated mass murder. And that protection was enabled by the very institution that claimed to stand for compassion, redemption, and truth. As more documents surface, the story of the rat lines stands as one of the most unsettling chapters in Vatican history. It is a reminder that in times of crisis, moral clarity can be obscured by fear, and that the decisions made behind closed doors can echo for generations. The question lingers still. When faced with the choice between protecting the innocent and sheltering the guilty, why did the Church choose silence? The long shadow of the Reichskonkordat stretches across nearly a century of debate, shaping how historians, religious leaders, and the public view the Catholic Church's actions during World War II. Signed in 1933 between the Holy See and Nazi Germany, the Concordat was meant to secure protections for German Catholics. Yet its legacy is anything but clear-cut. It remains a focal point for discussions about moral compromise, institutional survival, and the cost of negotiating with totalitarian regimes. The core trade-off was stark. The Church would be allowed to operate its schools and celebrate its sacraments, while stepping away from direct political engagement. This meant dissolving Catholic organizations, like the Centre Party, one of the last remaining obstacles to Hitler's consolidation of power. That withdrawal helped ease the Nazi path toward unchecked control. The timing of the agreement is central to its controversy. By mid-1933, the Nazi regime had already begun its campaign of repression. The Vatican's willingness to formalize relations sent a signal of legitimacy just as the regime's brutality became increasingly evident. For many observers then and now, this recognition felt like a miscalculation that emboldened a dangerous government. Some defenders argue the Vatican had few options, with fascism rising on one side and communism threatening religious freedom on the other. Figures like Cardinal Eugenio Pacelli, later Pope Pius XII, believed the Concordat was a pragmatic safeguard. From that view, it was less about endorsement and more about protecting the Church's spiritual mission amid political upheaval. But the Nazis quickly violated the agreement. Catholic institutions were harassed, publications censored, and clergy arrested. Though the Vatican issued protests, its ability to enforce the treaty was limited. Rather than a shield, the Concordat became a tool of Nazi propaganda, helping present the regime as internationally credible, while silencing organized Catholic opposition at home. More significantly, the Concordat shaped the Vatican's wartime stance. Pope Pius XII, who helped broker the deal, stayed neutral even as genocide reports reached Rome. Vatican archives opened in 2020 showed he had detailed knowledge of Nazi atrocities by 1942. Yet the Church remained silent, possibly fearing that speaking out would worsen conditions or endanger its operations under occupation. This strategic silence has divided opinion. Some argue Pius XII worked behind the scenes to protect Jews and others in danger, believing quiet diplomacy was more effective. Others see his restraint as a moral failure, a missed opportunity to offer a strong, spiritual and ethical rebuke at a critical moment in history. The Reichskonkordat's legacy underscores a deeper dilemma. How should religious institutions act when their survival conflicts with their moral mission? The Vatican, as both a spiritual authority and a political state, faced pressures that few others could fully understand. Yet with that complexity came decisions that continue to define perceptions of its integrity. Ultimately, the Concordat remains more than a historical document. It challenges us to examine how institutions wield influence in times of crisis, and how that influence should be used. As newly opened archives shed light on the Vatican's wartime choices, the questions raised by the Reichskonkordat still resonate, not just about what happened, but about how faith, power, and responsibility should coexist when the world is on fire. Looking at the Vatican's actions during World War II, we're reminded that even the world's most revered institutions are not immune to the pressures of politics, fear, and survival. The decision to sign the Reichskonkordat with Nazi Germany, despite profound ideological contradictions, was not just a diplomatic maneuver. It was a reflection of the Church's urgent desire to protect its presence in an increasingly hostile world. But history leaves few secrets buried forever. The chilling words of Father Lothar Kuhl's 1942 letter, describing thousands of people being killed daily, reveal just how much the Vatican knew and how early. It wasn't ignorance, it was a choice. A choice to speak softly, to remain neutral, to shield the Church's structure, even as the world around it burned. As more archives emerge from the shadows, the story deepens. It's not simply about silence. It's about the tension between spiritual mission and institutional survival, between doing what is safe and what is right. So tonight, as you close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep, consider this. Moral leadership is not proven in comfort, but in crisis. And sometimes the quiet pages of the past still echo with questions we're only just learning how to ask.